In February 1994, California State Fullerton University student Kathy Torres was only 20 years old when she was viciously stabbed to death. Although detectives found her body in the trunk of her car within a week, it took them nearly 2 decades to finally catch her killer, her on-again off-again boyfriend Sam Lopez. Lopez confessed to the murder in 2015 and claimed that he took everything away from her. He was convicted of first-degree murder and was given a sentence of 26 years to life in prison. His cousin, Xavier Lopez, was also sentenced to prison for helping him commit the crime.
Kathy Torres grew up in Placentia, California.
She was attending California State Fullerton as a sociology major, wanting to fulfill her dreams of becoming a social worker. She worked 2 jobs while attending school and lived with her mother Mary, stepfather, and 3 siblings. Kathy was known for being a marvelous person with a bright future ahead of her. In 1993, Kathy reconnected with Sam Lopez, her high school sweetheart.
Sam's brother Armando was married to Kathy's elder sister Tina at the time.
Soon after reconnecting, Sam and Kathy began a tumultuous relationship. The couple, along with Sam's cousin, would often spend time together at Kathy's workplace, a local drugstore called Save-On. However, things soon fell apart when the 20-year-old failed to return home as usual on February 12, 1994, after her shift at Save-On. She was soon reported missing. A few days later, on February 19, Kathy's missing car, a red 1990 Toyota Corolla, was spotted in a hospital parking lot by a patrolling officer. The front seat of the car, along with the bumper, was reportedly covered in blood and her body was found in the car trunk with at least 74 stab wounds. An autopsy revealed that she was stabbed in the face, head, and upper body with fatal slits to her wrists and neck. Her purse was missing and the driver's seat was completely reclined, which was unusual as Kathy wasn't very tall. Police noted that Kathy was allegedly still alive when she was shoved into the trunk, apparent from a visible handprint found inside. Medical examiners determined the cause of death as exsanguination drained of blood due to all the stab wounds.
Kathy's the missing persons case was soon turned into a homicide.
From the start, detectives suspected Kathy Torres' on and off boyfriend Sam Lopez, who had a fake alibi and claimed that he was with his cousin Xavier. Without any physical evidence, the case went cold for nearly 21 years and was only reopened several years later when Xavier was linked to the DNA found on the victim's clothes. Sam Lopez was ultimately found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to 26 years to life in prison. Meanwhile, Xavier Lopez was sentenced to 4 years and 8 months after pleading guilty to involuntary manslaughter. Xavier reportedly testified that he was in his truck when the couple got into an argument during which Sam attacked Kathy. He then helped Sam in disposing of the body. The murder of Lynette White in 1988 led to one of Britain's most notorious miscarriages of justice. Her killer was finally jailed in 2003 after 15 years. But what else do we know about her and the murder? Lynette White was murdered on February 14, 1988, in her Docklands flat in Cardiff. Before the fatal incident, the 20-year-old had been working as a prostitute in the city center. 5 days before her murder, White went missing and made no contact with any of her friends or known associates. The reason for her disappearance during this period has never been ascertained. She was due to be called as a witness for the prosecution in 2 forthcoming trials but was reportedly laying low. On the evening of February 14, police forced entry into a flat on Jane Street as they searched for the missing witness and found Lynette's body inside. She had been stabbed more than 60 times by an unknown assailant. After the murder, South Wales police issued a photofit image of a bloodstained, white male seen near the scene of the crime but were unable to trace him. In November 1988, police charged 5 black and mixed-race men with Lynette's murder despite having no scientific evidence linked to them being at the crime scene. The men, who became known as the Cardiff Five, were unexpectedly arrested in response to local yacht club secretary Violet Perriam telling detectives she remembered seeing a number of suspicious black men near the flat where Lynette was killed. The 5 men were quickly accused of the murder, despite the police having previously said they were looking for a lone white male. In November 1990, after the longest murder trial in British history, 3 of them were found guilty and were sentenced to life imprisonment. The real murderer was Jeffrey Gafford. In September 2000, an independent review into unsolved murders in South Wales paved the way for a fresh inquiry. 8 years later, South Wales police reopened the case and discovered fresh forensic evidence at the scene, including specks of blood on the cellophane wrapper of a cigarette packet and on a skirting board, which had since been painted over. This started the hunt for a new suspect who was dubbed the Cellophane Man. After scientists looked into one of the rare DNA components, they narrowed down a list of people who had that component, with one result particularly sticking out. That partial match was with a youth who was not born when the 1988 killing took place, but who had had dealings with the police. But testing of the 14-year-old's family found a close relative whose DNA matched that of Cellophane Man's, and he was instantly suspected as Lynette's murderer. That relative's name was Jeffrey Gaffor, who had worked as a security guard at his family's shop in nearby Roath at the time of Lynette's death. In 2003, Gaffor was arrested by police, but in a bid to avoid justice, the suspect attempted to commit suicide by taking an overdose of pills when he realized he was about to be apprehended. But, as police had Gaffor under surveillance, they prevented him from doing so and took him to hospital. It was on his way to get medical attention that he confessed to killing Lynette. Gaffor was sentenced at Cardiff Crown Court to life in prison for the 1988 murder. The defendant had explained to the court that on the last night of Lynette's life, he had paid her for sex up front but changed his mind when he saw the state of her flat in Butestown, which had no electricity or running water. He then demanded back his £30, which she refused, before attacking her in fury. Prosecutor Patrick Harrington described the moment Gaffor confessed to the court. He took a deep breath and said, "Just for the record, I did kill Lynette White. I have been waiting for this for 15 years. Whatever happens to me, I deserve it." He was ordered to serve a minimum of 13 years. Mr. Justice John Royce, who sentenced Gaffor, said, "For 15 years, you kept your guilty secret and evaded justice even while others stood trial for the murder you knew that you had committed. The notorious murderer has not been deemed suitable for release, according to the parole board." The coronavirus pandemic prevented Gaffor from making as much progress as hoped, since he was transferred to an open prison in September 2020. While in prison, Gaffor has reportedly taken part in programs to address his decision-making, better ways of thinking and tendency to use violence. In 2023, it was recommended that Gaffor could be allowed out on day release, but was not yet suitable to be allowed out on license following a parole board review. Nearly 22 years after Christine Frank was found dead in her Orlando apartment, the man accused of fatally shooting the UCF student is on trial for first-degree murder. Benjamin Lee Holmes, 42, was arrested in 2018 after detectives turned to genealogists to help them identify the source of DNA found at the crime scene. During opening statements, Holmes's attorney did not dispute that his client's DNA was found on the victim's body. But the defense claims someone else staged the crime scene to frame Holmes. The DNA evidence was planted by someone who knew the victim to deflect attention away from someone else, defense attorney Jerry Gurley told the jury. Gurley did not immediately indicate how someone else may have obtained his client's body fluid before allegedly planting it at the crime scene. Prosecutors promised jurors that circumstantial evidence presented during the trial would point to Holmes as the killer. "Every crime scene tells a story," said Assistant State Attorney Sean Wiggins. On October 21, 2001, officers with the Orlando Police Department responded to the Colonial Gardens apartments on Plaza Terrace Drive where neighbors had found Frank dead. The UCF student was lying face down and partially undressed with a single gunshot wound in her head. Approximately $300 in tip money Frank had likely earned that day while working at Cigars Bar at Universal Orlando City Walk was missing from the apartment, police records show. The medical examiner's office found no indication she had been raped. However, investigators discovered drops of seminal fluid on Frank's body that they believe was left behind by the man who shot her. Over the next decade, records show OPD detectives collected DNA samples from numerous friends, neighbors, coworkers, customers, and other potential suspects, but none matched the DNA found at the crime scene. In 2018, Orlando detectives learned about the arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo, the suspected Golden State Killer who murdered at least 12 people and raped more than 50 women in California in the 1970s and 1980s. D'Angelo was identified as a suspect after California investigators uploaded the killer's DNA to a genealogy database in hopes of locating potential relatives. Exactly 2 weeks after D'Angelo's arrest, Orlando police received an email from Parabon Nanolabs, a DNA analysis company, stating that it had received promising matches after entering DNA data from the front crime scene into a genealogy database called GEDmatch. OPD immediately granted Parabon permission to use both genetic analysis and traditional genealogical research to assemble the alleged killer's family tree. According to police records, GEDmatch produced a list of 1,500 people in the database who had DNA profiles with similarities to the suspect's genetic information. Years earlier, Georgia resident John Hogan had submitted a sample of DNA from his mouth to the genealogy service Ancestry DNA to learn which of his relatives may have been slaves.
Hogan later shared his DNA information with GEDmatch.
"I was always interested in my heritage, my family, and my culture," Hogan said in a 2019 interview with News 6. "When you told me my DNA helped solve a 17-year cold case murder, I just couldn't believe it." Through genealogical research, investigators constructed a family tree that included Hogan's great-grandparents, Charlie and Mary Bergman, and nearly 100 of their descendants. In late October 2018, OPD detectives Michael Fields and Michael Morrissey traveled more than 200 miles to Valdosta, Georgia, to obtain a DNA sample from 79-year-old Eleanor Holmes, one of the Bergmans' grandchildren. 2 days later, police received a report from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Laboratory stating that the DNA profile from semen at the crime scene is consistent with being the biological child of Eleanor Holmes.
Both of those children lived in Central Florida.
After ruling out Holmes' brother Reginald as a suspect because DNA he left behind on a discarded Gatorade bottle did not match the crime scene DNA, investigators began surveilling Holmes. In October 2018, an undercover detective watched as Holmes drank a beer and smoked a cigar in the driveway outside a friend's home. When Holmes walked inside, another detective collected 7 cigar butts from the area located on public property.
Investigators took the evidence to the FDLE crime lab, which quickly produced another report.
The DNA profile from the small cigar analyzed was a match as a contributor to the suspect DNA sample, Fields wrote in a report.
Based on this information, Benjamin Lee Holmes Jr. is the suspect in the murder of Christine Frank. In the years leading up to this week's trial, Holmes's attorney unsuccessfully attempted to bar prosecutors from presenting the DNA evidence to a jury. The attorney claims detectives told Holmes's mother they needed her to provide a DNA sample to help identify a murder victim. As part of Holmes's defense, Gurley plans to show jurors that there is no other evidence connecting his client to the crime scene, including fingerprints, hair, shoe prints, or skin cells. Gurley also said prosecutors have no evidence Holmes had ever been seen with Frank or lived near her apartment. As Mr. Holmes sits here, the real killer is out there, living his or her life, and not being held accountable, Gurley told jurors. Anthony Sanchez waits on death row, his execution just months away.
He is going to pay the ultimate price for a rape and murder he did not commit, according to his father's former girlfriend, who says Sanchez Sr. confessed to the crime to her. Speaking to the media for the first time, Charlotte Beatty told Newsweek that Thomas Glenn Sanchez repeatedly admitted to killing Julie Busken before his death. "He told me about it a few times, saying that he had to hogtie her 'cause she squealed," she said. "He said after he finished the job with her, he just shot her in the head. She feared the same fate would befall her if she ever told anyone. I was afraid, because he'd say that he could end up doing to me as he did to Julie Busken," she said. Busken, a 21-year-old ballerina from Benton, Arkansas, had just finished her final semester at the University of Oklahoma when she was abducted from her apartment in Norman on December 20, 1996. Her body was found near Lake Stanley Draper that evening. Authorities said she had been bound, raped and shot in the back of the head. After 8 years of few leads, police charged the then 25-year-old Sanchez Jr. in 2004. Investigators said a DNA sample taken from him when he was imprisoned for burglary had matched DNA recovered from the pink leotard found on Busken's body. 2 years on, he was convicted and sentenced to die. Now 44, he is set to receive a lethal injection on September 21. He has always maintained he did not kill Busken, telling Newsweek from prison that he was convicted on pure circumstantial evidence.
Beatty and others who believe in his innocence are now scrambling to save his life. An attorney for Sanchez Jr. asked the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals for an evidentiary hearing earlier this year, alleging that his father was the actual killer. In the court filing, Mark Barrett wrote that Beatty first heard Sanchez Sr. confess in July of 2020 but was too afraid of him to come forward while he was alive. The filing noted that neither of the two eyewitnesses identified Sanchez Jr. as the perpetrator during their testimonies and that evidence taken from Busken's vehicle, including 49 fingerprints and hair, were not matched to him. Importantly, the filing said, a police sketch crafted with the help of a witness who saw Busken and the perpetrator appears to match a photo of Sanchez Sr. taken in 1996. The court last month rejected the claim, with Judge David Lewis writing in a ruling, indeed, considering the remaining evidence, even if Glenn Sanchez had confessed his guilt on the witness stand under oath at Anthony Sanchez's murder trial, no reasonable fact finder would have acquitted Anthony Sanchez of killing Julie Busken. In a statement to Newsweek, Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond said the evidence is overwhelming that Anthony Sanchez brutally raped and murdered Julie Busken. Instead of expressing remorse, he made the cowardly decision to try blaming the crime on his deceased father, a ludicrous allegation thoroughly discredited by DNA analysis. What makes this claim all the more despicable is that it makes a mockery of how advances in DNA evidence have exonerated wrongly convicted individuals in recent years. Just as DNA evidence has helped clear the innocent, it can also conclusively show guilt. Anthony Sanchez is guilty beyond any conceivable doubt, and I will ensure justice is served. Advocates for Sanchez have questioned the DNA evidence used to secure the conviction, saying it was mishandled and manipulated, and argue other evidence, including ballistic evidence, was not credibly connected to Sanchez Jr. He said he had been let down by his trial lawyers, who he said didn't check his alibis or even his address. He didn't live a mile from Busken at the time of her murder like prosecutors alleged, he said, but in the next town over. Prosecutors at trial said Busken's missing cell phone was used to call a number belonging to an ex-girlfriend of Sanchez Jr.'s. He insists it wasn't the right number. Sanchez Jr. was a boy who had to raise himself, Beatty recalled. She remembers his father as an alcoholic and opioid abuser with a short temper who physically and sexually abused her for years. He took his own life on her front porch on the evening of April 24 last year, she said. He was 68. Beatty met Sanchez Sr. in meat-cutting school in the early 1990s, but they lost touch when she moved. In 1994, she said he contacted her and told her he had divorced. I started going around with him and we just went places and we had a nice time, she said. The following year, she gave birth to their son, now 27. Just months earlier, he had met another woman who would go on to become his third wife. But he kept on coming back and forth, Beatty said, adding that he often mooched off her to pay for his drinking. And over the years, he started getting more hateful, she said. He took his anger out on her, she said, describing in graphic terms the sexual assaults he subjected her to. If I screamed, he'd go further, she said. He was also impotent, she remembered, which often made him more vicious in his abuse. Beatty said Sanchez Sr. first mentioned Busken's killing to her several years ago, but then kept on bringing it up. He'd say, I'll hunt you down and I'll kill you if you say something, she said. That's how he was whenever he was telling me about Julie Busken. There were a few times he talked about it sober. He just kept on talking about it. Sanchez Sr. was diagnosed with cancer in February last year, Beatty said. A lump on his neck grew to the size of a baseball by the end, meaning he couldn't talk much. He never expressed remorse, she said. He just kept on saying that at least Anthony's a man. I'd say, why would you want him to suffer for it? He said, well, because he's young, and he can handle it. David Ballard, an investigator hired by Sanchez Jr.'s attorney and death penalty opponents to examine the case, said he found that many who knew Sanchez Sr. described him as paranoid, and that most who knew him were affected by his abuse. That includes Kathy Hodge, who married Sanchez Sr. in 1980 when Anthony was a little over a year old. I raised him, she told Newsweek. She spoke of the physical abuse she regularly suffered over the course of the 14-year marriage. It started off just a slap here, slap there, and it got worse and worse, she said. During the week, everything was normal. It was usually on the weekends when he started drinking, and he would get to a certain point and then he got real abusive.
But what many who knew the father and son agree on is that the police sketch looks a lot like Sanchez Sr. and nothing like his son. That sketch shows an apparently older man with hollowed cheekbones and shoulder-length hair.
Sanchez Jr. was a teenager with hair down his back at the time of Buskin's killing.
It did resemble Glenn. It didn't look anything like Anthony, Hodge said. I believe in his innocence, 100%. There's too many things that prove he didn't do it. Sanchez Jr. does not want to believe his father committed the crime he may soon pay the ultimate price for, but he concedes that the sketch does resemble his dad.
I have very mixed emotions about it, he said. It does look like my father.
The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation in February compared Sanchez's DNA to that recovered from Buskin's leotard, the Oklahoman reported, and concluded the DNA did not match that from Buskin's leotard. The state's attorneys said the new tests were conducted in an effort to fully and unequivocally debunk the new claim. Ballard, the investigator hired by Sanchez Jr.'s lawyer, questioned the DNA handling and profiling, a technology in its infancy at the time, that was done in the case. The testing and results were questionable at best, he said.
It needs to be redone. A spokesperson for the Attorney General's office said there was no evidence to suggest the DNA was not properly collected or stored.
The spokesperson said the profile obtained from Buskin's leotard by the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation in 2000 matched exactly to a DNA profile separately obtained by Oklahoma City Police. Sanchez Sr. was excluded, but the testing found that it was highly likely to belong to the biological father of the attacker. Ballard, president of Valor Investigations LLC of Norman, said he feels confident that Sanchez Jr. did not kill Buskin, noting that the heinous crime pointed to someone with a propensity to violence. He didn't match the profile, the physical evidence isn't there, and there's just a lot of conjecture on his case, Ballard said. There are things right now that can be done on the Anthony Sanchez case that could very much clear his name that we're not in possession of.
Fingerprints, skin cells and hair found in Buskin's vehicle should be tested against Sanchez Sr.'s, he said.
Sanchez Jr.'s attorneys and advocates also dispute the state's assertion that a shoe print at the crime scene was connected to him. They never found the shoe, Ballard noted, but an ex-girlfriend told authorities that he owned a similar pair. The print was of a size 9, Ballard says.
If they checked my foot, they would have known I was size 11.5, Sanchez Jr. said. And it's a mass-produced shoe, Ballard added.
There's so many unanswered questions, and a lot of the evidence was inconclusive, but labeled as, "this matches." Ballard said a detective had looked at Sanchez Sr. as a more plausible suspect early on in the investigation but was shut down. The Reverend Jeff Hood, who met Sanchez Jr. last summer, told Newsweek he was initially skeptical of Sanchez's innocence claim. It was the sketch that made him delve deeper and team up with Death Penalty Action, a non-profit organization that works to stop executions and abolish the death penalty, to raise funds to pay for the investigator. Hood said he feels the state jumped to test Sanchez Sr.'s DNA earlier this year without being ordered to do so in a bid to cut us off before we were able to present evidence of what we feel like was DNA manipulation at the very beginning. He argued that Sanchez Jr., who is Native American, has as strong an innocence claim as another inmate on death row in Oklahoma, Richard Glossop, who is white. Glossop was accused of ordering the 1997 killing of motel owner Barry Van Trees but has maintained his innocence, and there have been persistent doubts about the evidence against him. "We want the Glossop treatment," he said. "We want a person of color who has an innocence claim in Oklahoma to be taken as seriously as a white person who has an innocence claim in Oklahoma." Abraham Bonowitz, Death Penalty Action's executive director, praised legislators and Oklahoma's attorney general for exploring Glossop's case. "The real test," Bonowitz said, "is if Oklahoma's political leaders will similarly step up for Sanchez. His life is valuable too. There are real and urgent questions about his guilt also," Bonowitz said. "He deserves every bit as much of a reinvestigation as Glossop got." Hood has already accompanied two men to the death chamber this year, Scott Eisenberg in Oklahoma and Arthur Brown Jr. in Texas, and watched as the lethal injection coursed through their veins. He doesn't want to do it again with Sanchez Jr. On Thursday morning, he and others will gather at the Oklahoma State Capitol to launch a campaign aimed at saving Sanchez's life. "Sanchez is a test," Hood said, "of whether there is even a modicum of morality left in the governance of the state of Oklahoma. If they can't stop themselves from killing a demonstrably innocent man, I pray that God damns them all."
On April 28, 1997, the city of Thousand Oaks was considered one of the safest places to live in the country by the FBI. It was Mayberry in America until 10:20 a.m. That's when Thousand Oaks and Los Angeles County were never the same. On that Monday at Western Financial Bank, there was a manager and 3 tellers. There was no security guard, no locking front door. There was no plexiglass to protect or separate employees. The tellers were sitting ducks when 2 armed men walk in. With nylon stockings over their faces, they were disguised as construction workers. The guys who committed this robbery are not stupid. Putting on the disguise and going in with simply adding a reflective vest and a hard hat that draws your attention away from the face, Captain Eric Buschow with the Ventura County Sheriff Department explained. The robbers got all the employees into the back room in front of the safe. Bank teller Monica Leach was ordered to open it. It would be the last thing she ever did. To understand what happened on that deadly April morning, we have to go to the home of the Crips. The suspects in this cold case are believed to be Crips gang members, and investigators believe they are still alive. Perry Dito meets us in front of the South Park sign. He's a larger-than-life personality. Everyone at this community park either knows him or needs him. He spends most of his afternoons here after work. It's his second home. It's where he raised himself and started gangbanging as a 10-year-old boy. It's also a place where Crips gang members gather today. For Dito, joining the Crips as a child didn't feel like joining a gang. It was a means of survival. He stole food so his friends could eat. He found people to trust and depend on amid so much uncertainty. My generation is the first batch of kids to have crack mamas. And when we were growing up, we had friends of mine that parents weren't able to take care of them, Dito said. Dito recalled it was not his family but the local drug dealer that bought him shoes so he could play football. It's like a flock of sheep without a shepherd. When my mom died, my grandma still had 3 kids staying at home, so I had so much built-up anger in me because I feel cheated. Gangbanging gave me an opportunity to act out. To get a better understanding of the history of the Crips, we interviewed Dr. Georgia Leap, a professor at the UCLA Luskin School who has been working with gangs for 40 years. The Crips are really one of the oldest gangs in the Southwest Angeles area. Their roots are very much here. Ironically, they have spread all over the world. I've met Crips gang members from Australia. I think it's significant to add that while their reputation lies in the fact that they've been involved in gang activity and criminal behavior, they've also been involved in some significant social services. To understand the Crips is to understand a very lengthy, very complex picture of a street organization that began in the Southern California area, Leap said. People think that gangs are about criminal activity, but they're really about economics. What happened in South LA is factories that were nearby on Alameda Street began to close down, and job opportunities and income narrowed significantly. When those factories closed in the 1970s, thousands of people lost their jobs, and the area never recovered. That same decade, California voters approved Prop 13. That was a big win for homeowners. It capped property tax increases, but it meant a huge cut to programs that those taxes paid for, like school programs, law enforcement, and social services. This is sort of what you had percolating in South Los Angeles with the Crips. It was what actually civil rights attorney Connie Rice often refers to as the spiral of despair. You don't see the pain that goes into gang membership. You never see the reasons why people join gangs, Leap said. You usually see a group of black youth or youth of color who are wearing bandanas and who are planning a mission. We don't contextualize it, there's a whole environment. There's a whole cause and effect around it, said Leap. In the late 80s to the early 90s, in order to make money, the Crips largely sold drugs. The gang generally made enough money to get by. But what radically changed the game, according to Dito, was a group of white surfers. And just like that, seemingly overnight, Southern California became the bank robbery capital of the country. There are banks on virtually every corner throughout Southern California. A lot of them are located in convenient places where it's easy to get off the freeway and stop in and take care of a transaction, especially going back before ATMs. Banks invested in security based on certain branches being frequent targets of robberies. The ones that were either less frequently robbed or virtually never robbed, that might have been a little further outlying and not right next to a freeway corridor,
there was less investment in security, said Buschow. During the 90s, Southern California became the Wild West. At its peak in 1992, the FBI estimates more than 2,600 banks were robbed. That's an average of 7 banks per day. And instead of fighting each other in South LA, gangs started venturing to places like Thousand Oaks. 50 miles from South LA, the community of Thousand Oaks seems otherworldly. It's a place where people leave their doors unlocked. It's where Floyd Leach has lived for most of his life and where he met his second wife Monica. At the time, Floyd Leach was 43. He still lives in the same area in a home just a couple miles from the former Western Financial Bank. I think about it a lot. Every time I talk to one of her kids, it comes back. Her kids now have kids. I'm still close with all of her family, Floyd Leach said. Monica and Floyd met in church. Their love blossomed beautifully and naturally. It was the first time Floyd felt happy in months. Monica worked in banking for 20 years. After she got married to Floyd to be closer to home, she transferred to Western Financial Bank. She worked there for about 2 months and started getting to know her customers like the chiropractor next door. It was definitely a normal day at first, at least I thought it was. In between patients, I'd often go over to my office, which overlooked the parking lot. And that's when I saw somebody just barrel right by my office super fast. It was unusual. So I took note, but I didn't hear anything, so I went and saw the next patient in the room. That's when I got the call immediately to come out because one of the tellers was there saying that Monica had been shot, said Dr. Rich Schwartzberg. He's a doctor chiropractic, who at the time had an office right there next to the bank. Everybody was saying, is there anything you do to help? I said, I can try. During the CPR part, obviously, maybe for a second, it looked like things might be improving, but it was pretty rapidly apparent it wasn't, he said. She led them to the vault, gave them money, did everything they demanded, and for reasons that we still don't understand, the person who was handcuffing her held a gun to the back of her head. He shot her, said Buschow. Monica was the only one who was shot. She died on the vault room floor. To the robbers, her life was worth a few $1,000s. They got away with $9,000. It wasn't a video game that you can just reset and make it all back the way it was, lamented Floyd Leach. She was a real person. She was very loving. And loved her family and her kids and a real person. For a long time, it was hard for Floyd to talk about Monica. But for the first time in decades, he's ready to revisit that devastating Monday again. In fact, he's the reason this case is back in the spotlight. His persistence inspired the Ventura County Sheriff's Office to re-examine old evidence. The 2 bank robbers who killed Monica that day still haven't been caught. Shortly after Monica's brutal killing, local banks and donors raised $160,000 in reward money for whoever turned in the suspects. There was surveillance video. The images weren't great, but they were still usable. Witness descriptions also helped produce composite sketches. Police even got the getaway car. And yet, no arrests. We don't often see something go this long without the right pieces of information coming into our lab, especially at the time with that larger award. There were banks that came together and put up money to encourage people to come forward. The vehicle was later recovered. They repainted it. We have those pieces of evidence. We have those handcuffs. We have the evidence collected from inside the bank. We just need to get those last couple of pieces to carry this across the goal line, said Buschow. Now 24 years later, there is some hope for a break in the case. Evidence that's been sitting in storage for decades can now be retested with new equipment that extracts trace amounts of DNA. Touch DNA is when somebody basically touches an item and deposits some of their cells onto it. These cells have considerably less DNA in them than bodily fluids, like blood or saliva or semen. So with technology advancing over the years, it's gotten a lot more sensitive to be able to detect smaller amounts of DNA. This has become very helpful in cases where the only evidence available is touch DNA, explained Christina Tokadlian. She's a forensic scientist and local CODIS administrator at Ventura County Sheriff's Office Forensic Services Bureau. If the DNA is viable, it'll be uploaded to the Combined DNA Index System or CODIS. It's a computer database that connects DNA labs at the local, state and national levels.
It checks the DNA profiles of thousands of convicted offenders, unidentified remains and relatives of missing people. I believe that if people do bad things, they need to pay for what they do. Getting those guys who would just close a chapter in my life. Not the memories, but as far as closing the chapter of wondering where these guys are and what they're doing today, Floyd said. Monica Leach's 1997 murder happened at a small bank in Thousand Oaks. But if you follow the clues to the origin of this story, you end up in South LA. We know that this was done by a crew of Crips gang members from LA. We had several involving this crew and similar crews coming up to Ventura County and targeting banks, and they were doing this all over Southern California. That was their preferred method of getting money, was going around doing these takeover robberies. You know, the FBI had numerous cases throughout Southern California involving this crew and other crews that were part of an organized criminal street gang, said Buschow. Perry Dito doesn't know who did this, but believes he knows why it happened. A lot of them dudes doing them robberies was desperate. I'm not saying they was right for doing it, but them dudes was desperate, Dito said. Desperation and poverty. Is that what makes a cold-blooded killer? Not necessarily. But it's a starting point. Dito was one of the many Crips that ended up serving time for robbery. He didn't kill anyone, but he knows the pain he caused. I went to jail first time for second-degree robbery. And do you regret that? I regret it. I regret it. I really didn't have to go. But I didn't have nobody show me nothing different. I didn't have nobody. I didn't have high self-esteem. I think about the victim. If I had the chance to meet the victim again, I would shake his hand and I would apologize to him. I didn't get away with nothing, but just the traumatization, and I would say, bro, I was young, I apologize for that, bro. At the time my situation felt desperate, bro. The situation for Dito is different today. He's part of a group called United We Stand Up. They work to bring Bloods and Crips together and keep peace on the streets. It's one of the main reasons he remains an active gang member. They are very intent on healing this community and many others like it. And they feel it is sort of what they've got to do. They have to heal these communities that they once sought to destroy. And they are very dedicated, first of all, to healing the community. And second of all, to making sure youth do not follow that same pathway. And they're the most significant messengers in this effort, he said. I feel like I grew up in an orphanage. These dudes already been left already. They got shortchanged already. People turned their back on them already. They don't need me to turn my back on them too. I love the hood, but I'm not gonna do no violence for the hood, said Dito. From Avalon on the east side of South LA to Thousand Oaks Boulevard on the outskirts of LA County, families were impacted and affected by pain and suffering. This affected so many people. This kind of act, it wasn't just affecting me. It affected her kids. It affected my kids. It affected her parents and her siblings and their kids and aunts and uncles and cousins, said Floyd Leach. These people have families. When this first happened, Monica's 2 children went to live with their father. The kids were 11 and 14 years old, so they went through their teen years and adolescence without a mom. Dr. Leach believes gangs will continue to be a thread in the fabric of our society. Are gangs ever going to end? No, there are gangs everywhere. There will always be gangs. But she said the solution to decrease their scope and reach lies with all of us. What's really important is that we have the right people working with gang members. This is not a law enforcement issue, but this is a public health issue. This is community issue. This involves our families, our children, people that we know. And more than anything, we have to confront the issues that brought them into existence in the first place. Poverty. Did I say poverty? While Monica's murder had far-reaching ramifications for Leach and his family, her death is deeply personal. It marks a dark chapter in Floyd's life, one that he's ready to close and shut. It's been a tough road, you know, and I know that regardless how this works out, there's certain things that aren't going to go away. I got my faith in God that helps, well, probably takes care of all of it, you know? Detectives believe Monica's killers are still alive. There's currently a $31,000 reward for anyone with information that leads to their arrest. The FBI is offering $30,000 to the person or people who can provide info leading to the suspects in the case.
In addition, Ventura County Crime Stoppers will pay up to $1,000 for info that leads to the arrest and criminal complaint against the people responsible for Monica's murder. Calls to Crime Stoppers are not recorded, and the caller can remain anonymous. 800-222-TIPS 8477. If you know anything about that Monday in April, you're urged to contact the Ventura County Sheriff's Department's Detective Aaron Grass at 805-384-4726. Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe and like the video, and click the bell icon to stay tuned.